Hey y'all, welcome back to the Skookum Report. Happy day after Christmas, and I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas with family and friends. I have two Bigfoot encounter stories for y'all tonight, both from the same area of Kentucky. Now this first one, the gentleman wants to remain anonymous, and this happened in the winter of 1995 in Hopkins County, Kentucky. In an area he says called Lonesome Woods, near White Plains. He says 3 friends and myself were camping out the night before opening morning of deer season on November 7th, to be exact. We had set up camp in an area known as Lonesome Woods, and which covers about 3 counties. It's a really big area. It was really cold, and we had a really big fire going, and we were all sitting around it to stay warm, when all of a sudden we heard this weird moaning sound fill the woods. It sounded kind of like a siren, except it was much louder. It let off a series of 3 moans, starting low and then building and then dropping, in pitch as well as volume, in 3 separate bursts. This scared us because we all grew up in this area and we've hunted and camped here all our lives, and we've never heard such a sound in these woods at all. Now, not wanting to act scared, we all tried to laugh it off, but an uneasy feeling lingered throughout the camp for quite a while. Now that happened around 9 o'clock. And around 10:30, T, one of my friends who was camping with us, he stepped off into the woods to relieve himself. Now, he wasn't even gone for about 10 minutes when he came running back into camp saying, "I'm gone, and if y'all have any sense, you would leave too." We asked him what was wrong, and he told us he had seen something down by the creek located on the other side of the hill. It stood about 8 feet tall and appeared to be drinking from the stream as he came across the hill. Once on top of the hill, it took notice of him and it stood up and just watched him, or as T said, watched me run. Now, T had barely got those 3 words out of his mouth, watched me run, when we heard something running through the bush on top of the hill. My brother had a mining light, plus it was very bright from the moon that night, and the sky was spotless, and he shined the mining light up on the hill, and we all saw the silhouette of a very large creature running on top of the hill. We couldn't make out a color, but it was definitely human-shaped, running on 2 legs, and it had long arms, and it ran kind of hunched over. It seemed to look about 8 feet tall, and the sound it produced while running was amazingly loud. It sounded as though a truck was being driven over a road over a bunch of branches and twigs. This was enough for us. This scared the wits out of us, and we packed up what little bit we had and we left. And we had heard lots of stories about this area and never believed them, but now we do. And we know full well that there is something in those woods without a doubt. Shoo. Okay, this second encounter is also from Hopkins County, Kentucky, from a gentleman who wants to remain anonymous as well. This time it was the fall of 1990, and a daylight sighting interrupts hunters at an old mining area near Arlington, Kentucky. These encounters occurred on the property of the Heckley Mines. Some strip mining, I guess, was going on at one point. Now, he says, I have 2 incidents, and one is a vocalization, and the other is a sighting. I was about 15 at the time. Now, my dad and his best friend and myself were bow hunting on the Heckley mine property, and we arrived about an hour before sunup. My dad dropped me off at my stand, and then he followed the trail to his blind. His friend went down the trail to his stand. My stand was on the wooded edge of a coal flat surrounded by forest on 3 sides. The 4th side had an opening through the woods that had been used to allow trucks to haul the coal. Or at least I assume that's what it was for. The flat was about 60 yards wide and 60 yards deep and roughly circular in shape, and I was on the edge closest to the truck path and had several deer trails intersecting from the woods on each side of me and continuing across the flat and onto the truck path. Almost directly in front of me across the flat was a hill with a power line cut through. And they say they follow those power lines, and that's interesting. To my right was the truck path, and beyond it was some thick woods that ran up the hill and formed the right side of the cut through. Now, I had just gotten settled into my stand when I heard something running down the hill and through the woods on the other side of the truck path. It was still too dark to see, but I assumed it was a severely spooked deer because it sounded large and it was very loud. And when the sound seemed to get to the edge of the flat, it stopped for a moment. The next thing I heard was something running back and forth in the woods on the flat's edge, back and forth and back and forth. Then it would stop, and I would hear this loud knocking sound, kind of like a woodpecker, except much louder and much slower. It was just knock, 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 and then more running sounds. And this continued 3 or 4 more times. I was trying to figure out what the heck it was, and when I heard this scream that sent, and it still does just thinking about it right now, it sent a shudder and cold chills down my spine. Now, I've heard wildcat screams, I've heard coyotes make some odd noises, but this was unlike anything I've ever heard before. It was very loud, very deep and guttural, but with a high pitch to it as well. And after the first scream, it started running again, then knocking, then screaming again, over and over in the same pattern. Needless to say, I was beyond spooked. Luckily, the sun was starting to rise, but I still couldn't see anything in that area. And the next thing I know, the sound stopped. And I hear running up the hill, and I hear something walking up the trail behind me to my left. And it was my dad's best friend who had been in his stand, and he was coming to see what was making all that noise. He was kind of shook up as well. When my dad came out, he said he hadn't heard anything. His blind was a good ways off in the bottoms. Now, exactly 1 week later, I was sitting in my stand again as the sun came up. Now, for some reason, I kept being drawn back to that power line. It was still early October, so everything, even the grass, was still mostly green, but there were these big brown bushes sitting to my left off of the power line that I never noticed them before. And I realized what was also odd was that they seemed to be swaying slightly in the wind, except that there was no wind. As I'm sitting there watching it, one of the bushes stood up. It had the shape of a man, a head, arms, legs, etc. It was a medium brown color and was huge. I was beyond stunned. My mouth dropped open and my heart was beating so fast. Now, I heard a bird whistle to my right, and that was my dad's in the woods signal. He was sitting not 20 yards from me on a hill on the flat's edge. He pointed to his eyes and then pointed up the hill, basically asking me, did I see what he was seeing? I nodded, and we continued watching it as it started walking toward the right side woods. It would take a couple of steps, stop, and then look in our direction. It did this up until the time it entered the woods. Now, this all probably happened quickly, but to me it seemed like it was in slow motion. I started climbing out of my stand, and my dad came over and said, "We're going home." He was shook up as well. We didn't say much until we got to the truck and started home, and then we talked about how big it was and what we had seen and how maybe it was what had made all that noise the week earlier. Now, we think we saw a Sasquatch. We're pretty sure that it was a Bigfoot, but we don't tell too many people about it. Now, my dad grew up in these woods, and he had heard some strange things before when camping, and something seemed to be circling the camp and watching him, but he never saw anything until this sighting that I just told you about. And now this was the vocalization that happened in the early morning right before sunup, and it was still dark out, and it was clear weather, just a little wind. It was pretty chilly out. And on the morning of our sighting, it was after sunup. It was approximately 7 or 8 a.m. The sun was sunny, but it was just a little bit overcast, but there was no wind, and it was still cool out with, October temperatures. This whole area had been strip mined many years before, but the mining had only stripped certain areas, so where there were, big, vast, coal black flats surrounded by trees and rolling hills. There were also plenty of underground mining shafts still around, as well as sinkholes that opened up into them. Pretty dangerous area. It was a very interesting place to hunt, to say the least, and quite large. There were several creeks and bottoms that ran through those portions of the property, and a few swampy areas even. Most of the trees were hardwoods, but there was a few pines spread out in various parts. And from what I understand, my father, they resumed mining in that area, he told me a few years ago. And now the noises, he said, he heard on the first morning, they were about 40 yards into the thick forest. And it sounded like an entire football team, he said, breaking through the brush. Several extremely loud screams were heard, and they got louder and more powerful. They were louder and much more powerful than any animal the witness had ever heard, leaving him with what he called a primal fear. Now, on the second day, both the witness and his father viewed the creature. It was about 100 yards off, and they viewed him for over 20 seconds. And when the animal stood up, it appeared to be at least 7 feet tall, covered with shaggy reddish hair, and had the physique of a bodybuilder, they said. As it walked off and turned and looked back, the witness said it looked exactly like the bipedal animal from the Patterson and Gimlin film. Wow. Imagine that, sitting up in a tree stand and just seeing a Sasquatch walk out of the woods on you and being able to watch it for almost a half a minute. That would be so cool. As long as you were safe up in your tree stand and he wasn't coming towards you. But, man, I enjoy these Bigfoot encounters. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter or a sighting, please shoot me an email at skookumreport@gmail.com. That's skookumreport@gmail.com. And I'll be sure to get it up on the channel for you so everybody can hear it and enjoy it. And there's no judgment here, no ridicule. This is a safe place to share your encounters. I want to thank you all for coming back to the Skookum Report, and one more time wish you all a very Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays in the coming New Year. And I'll see you all again very soon. Thanks so much. Take care.